The first thing to talk about is what I'm going to be talking about in this lecture. I'm going to firstly be talking about what I want you guys to keep in mind or bear in mind throughout the process of the lecture, just kind of general lessons which I'm trying to teach here. Then I'm going to be talking about prioritizing things. So I'm going to teach you why you should be prioritizing other things over rebuttal. So namely weighing, rebuilding your case, and then prioritizing good rebuttal over bad rebuttal, because there's no point in saying bad rebuttal. Then I'm going to be telling you guys, if you really have to do your rebuttal, how you should be doing it, and how you can get better at doing that. So, firstly, notes. These are all things in this lecture which I'm trying to work on myself as well, and so that's important to bear in mind. I'm not lecturing you on how to be better, I'm lecturing all of us. But additionally, I've heard some of the things in this lecture before as well. And so the thing to bear in mind, if you've heard the thing in this lecture before, is ask yourself, am I doing this in every single debate consistently all the time? Because the reason why you've heard this feedback before is because it's like a ground rule of debating. And so if you don't have the habit of doing this every time, then that's something which you need to fix. Additionally, this is incredibly important for maybe stressful rounds such as our rounds, because you forget everything which you're trying to implement. You resort back to your habits, and so sort of creating habits out of the basic rules of debating, I think is something which is incredibly overlooked in debating, in as much as people should just be thinking about those kinds of things way more. The last thing is I'm going to be criticizing rebuttal in debating a little bit, but the thesis of the lecture is not don't rebut. The thesis is every single time you do a bit of rebuttal, think about what that rebuttal is doing in the round, and then you'll become much better, because sometimes rebuttal is important to do. The issue with rebuttal is that lots and lots of judges don't credit it. And if you've ever spoken seconds, then you probably know that you've just given, maybe your first speaker has given a bit of a shocking case, maybe it's a little bit underanalyzed, and you stand up and you give 7 minutes of the most banging shit you've ever given in your life, and the judge just talks about why your case is not actually that great. And this can be incredibly frustrating, but the reason for this is because the first speaker lays out the case and lays out a sort of stance for how the team should be, and the judge, or most judges in their mind, think, this is what the case or this team is defending, and this is what this team is arguing for. And so if you give maybe 6 independent pieces of rebuttal, it's very hard for the judge to sort of holistically track what you contributed to the debate, because it's 6 independent, maybe smaller things. And even if each of those things are very good, then it's hard for the judge to track that. And so rebuttal should be something which is incredibly precise and purposeful, but you should be doing other things, namely forwarding your case before you're doing rebuttal as well. So, this is what I basically just said. Judges have an image of debates in their heads, and basically, oftentimes, after the first speaker stands up, then the judge has an image of what the second speaker needs to be doing to also be winning, i.e. the top half, or beating the top half, or beating their closing opposition, for example, if you're in closing government. And they're thinking after your member, the gap in analysis is X or etc., which means that if you go and give some other pieces of rebuttal, which might not be that closely related to how the debate actually has played out, then that necessarily means that the judge is going to be disappointed, because you've not done the thing which they want you to do, to be able to check that box and say, you're beating this team. Which means that rebuttal obviously sort of frequently takes you on tangents, which the judge isn't wanting you to do. And this is obviously increasingly true for the more novel the rebuttal you have is. So that increasingly as the rebuttal is less relevant to what your case is, then the judge becomes more and more surprised by that rebuttal, and then it becomes harder for them to sort of play in their mind what this rebuttal is actually doing in the debate, which necessarily means that obviously there's more variance in the calls, so they're less able to track how good the rebuttal is. The first solution to this is prioritize weighing over rebuttal. And even if judges credited weighing an equal amount as rebuttal, weighing is just far more efficient to do the rebuttal, because with rebuttal, you have to beat each of the mechanisms or each of the reasons for why an argument is true to defeat that argument. Weighing, you have to just defeat the premise or the importance of that premise, which is obviously quite a lot less work, and you can spend a lot less time in your speech doing that. And that's super, super important given you only have 7 minutes, so you need to be prioritizing the best things in your team. Also, this is not to say that you shouldn't be rebutting at all when you're weighing. Oftentimes rebuttal is disguised as weighing. So even if you brand your rebuttal as weighing to a judge, then it seems more closely related to your case. So for example, your weighing can be, this argument is not that important for X, Y, Z reasons, and another person might think that this is mitigation, but obviously you can say this is weighing because you're saying why your argument is more important than their argument. And so sometimes there is room for rebuttal when you're doing your weighing, but be weighing more than you are rebutting. The second solution is add layers to your own case in order to rebut the other teams. So the second solution is more to make your case more on clash than it already is, or to fulfill a burden in your case that's already been missing. So the most important thing to do in any debate is make sure that your case itself is standing before you go on and do some other sort of, tangents about rebuttal, etc. You should be rebuilding your case first. And maybe this is integrating rebuttal within your own case, so saying why your case is sort of resistant to another team's case. But you should always be focusing on your case before you think of reasons why the other team is not true. So, in the motion, I'll give you a second to read it yourselves. In the motion, this House believes that climate activists should adopt hacktivism as a political strategy, i.e. they should do DDoS attacks on big companies. Then there are a couple, has everyone got it, the motion? Just nod or shake, or whatever. Okay, cool. There are a couple of things. So for example, if the government team runs, mean that companies aren't polluting as much, because they're being hacked and therefore they have an incentive to divest from climate harmful materials, then if you're on opposition and your partner runs, for example, your activists are going to go to jail because they're going to get arrested because hacking stuff is illegal. Then when you're responding to your government team, then the thing which you should be doing is not making up some other piece of rebuttal. It should be at least doing some strategical commentary. So saying why your case itself is prior. And this is incredibly important, I think, just as a note on strategic commentary. Even if you think it's intuitive that your case is beating the other case, you have to tell the judges why your case is doing that. And that's part of rebuttal as well. But also, you should be bolstering your case as well. So as well as saying, we're prior because if you have your activists in jail, then how are you supposed to be, stopping these companies from doing this or hacking effectively? You should also be saying why the government has the capacity to arrest all these people if your partner hasn't done that. And that's just a little illustration of what I was saying already. Something which is not a good idea to do is spend lots of your time proving why companies, might be resistant to this hacking, because that's not your case. Your case is on why your activists go to jail. Digression. Rebuttal in prep. So oftentimes it's hard to think of what rebuttal you should be doing or not. And given by this example, you might think that companies have good firewalls is on the face of it a good response. And especially when you're in the heat of the moment in a debate, it's often quite hard to think about, what strategy I should be leading with my rebuttal. And so thinking about it in prep is something which is incredibly important. So there's a very clear strategy to this round, which is you could build your case on how effective a policy is. So for example, if your comparative in the motion about hacktivism is not that your activists are going to do something less harmful or less violent, but rather your comparative is we're going to do violence that's actually on the ground, if that makes sense, then your rebuttal should follow a different strategy because your case is different. So if you're saying the comparative is going to be that we're going to do physical violence rather than hacking, then the rebuttal that says that these companies have good firewalls is actually good rebuttal in the round. And so there's not some sort of objective truth about what rebuttals you should be using, which is good or bad. Basically what I'm trying to point out is your rebuttal should be following what your case is talking about. So you can respond in different ways. So I think another feeling which might be common to people who are giving rebuttal is you feel as though another team just gave a case which you couldn't think of rebuttal quickly enough for. So they just constructed some absolute godly case which you hadn't predicted. And it's never true that this case is unbeatable, because the reason that CAs set this case or set this motion is because there's a clear trade-off in the debate, or there's clear pros and cons to every case. And so when you encounter this situation where you think this case is just too good to be beating in the debate, you should be thinking that's a prep issue, because you're not thinking in prep about how to beat the case with your partner. Instead, you're maybe thinking about constructing some argument, which might not be too relevant. And so this is really important for self-improvement as well, which is identifying the issue you had when you went into a round is often this, which is you're not preempting the other team enough. Let's talk about prioritizing rebuttal. Obviously, don't say bad stuff. This might be hard to identify, but I think a lot of times people say rebuttal for the sake of it. And this is one of the things which I was mentioning at the start of the lecture, which is, you will have heard this a million times, but it's actually so important just to internalize this and never give rebuttal which you think isn't doing something really important for the debate. For example, if you're, I might contradict this slightly later, if you're like bashing over the head of an argument which isn't that good in the debate, and you're spending lots and lots of time on it, even though that makes you feel incredibly clever because you're able to completely decimate an argument, it's not doing you anything in terms of like winning the round. And this is also sometimes why you might think that you gave like a really, really good speech and then you're still third or second around. And the reason for this is your rebuttal is actually going to be really clever, but it's not the most strategic rebuttal which you could be giving. You should be giving rebuttal which is better or doing more for the round. And I think, therefore, the natural instinct is obviously to give the rebuttal which you think on the face of it is the most clever, or making you win by the largest margins. But actually what you should be thinking about is what is the hardest piece of rebuttal that I can, or what is the hardest sort of goal that I have to achieve in this debate, and be focusing on that first. So making yourself be focused on the sort of least achievable thing in the debate before you start going on to the things which are easy to do, I think is something to make yourself disciplined in terms of doing. Yeah, I think the other thing is if you give a bad piece of rebuttal, which like might not be too strategic or might not be very clever, then this also makes your team lose on vibes. And sometimes judges do like reverse engineer calls as well, and so making sure you're not saying these kinds of things is also kind of incredibly important for this sort of like more trivial reason, other than the opportunity cost reason, which is you should be saying things which are maximizing the 7 minutes that you have. Okay. So this is where I'm getting slightly contradictory. I think it's incredibly important to point out when you're obviously beating a team, and maybe not obviously beating a team, but when you think a team is kind of easy to beat, I think judges are expecting you to say at least something. And this is one of the most sort of trivial and important uses of rebuttal, which is quickly glossing over why you're beating another team, just to sort of like ease the judge's mind. And so point out an obvious analytical gap, or plug in why they can never fill in that analytical gap. Or maybe give a quick real-world reason why their case can't be true. I think this is important to have in most speeches. So even in extension speeches, I think it's incredibly important to say maybe like why you're beating your OG or your OO. So I think doing this in a debate, but importantly heeding the lessons which I mentioned earlier, which is making it incredibly quick because you've got really important things to do in terms of the rest of your speech and the rest of your rebuttal. And so making sure to do this quickly is really important. Therefore, I think if you have to do rebuttal in the debate, i.e. your case is actually just really, really bad, or maybe their case is just completely off clash. Maybe they're talking about another actor in the debate, or maybe you can't really think of any pieces of weighing. I think the rule for rebuttal, and this isn't very constructive because it's sort of abstract, is basically find the most clear and concise objection to a good team's case. So this is talking about what I was talking about earlier, which is make sure that it's the thing which the judge has to make the fewest sort of like mental deviations to reach, i.e. what do we think the most obvious objection to their case is, and then sort of mention that, because then the judge is having to make the fewest leaps as possible in their brain, or sort of getting distracted the least amount by your rebuttal, and is sort of still on track with the debate. And so predicting what the judge is thinking about is incredibly important here as well. Also being rigorous is really important. Sometimes people respond to 3 out of 4 mechanisms and then the judge is just sitting waiting thinking like, what about the 4th? Their argument must still be true. And so making sure even if the 4th mechanism is not true, just pointing that out as well. I think just being rigorous is really important. If you're giving rebuttal, here's a very simple way to structure a rebuttal, which also lots of people don't do. The first thing is just to point out some sort of analytical gap with their argument, or some sort of strategic issue with their argument. And obviously if you're responding to an argument, then it must be true that there is some sort of issue with their argument so that you can be able to respond to it. And so giving a sort of topic sentence by saying, the issue with this argument is, and then your issue might be like, the issue with this argument is it's not very comparative, or the issue with this argument is it's unimpactful, or the issue is that it's missing a tipping point, etc. I think it's something which alerts the judges to know, to sort of prime them into sort of then talking about how you're going to specifically respond to that argument. So pointing out the issue with that piece of analysis, I think is a really important starting point. Then say why the gap is important to the case. Say why that gap is detrimental for their case, and then fill in that gap. So say, this can never be important because X, etc. Also don't lie. Don't lie about some sort of whole or don't lie about something that another team has said. This is another way you lose on vibes, is if a judge has tracked something and you don't, and you hadn't tracked something. So make sure that you're always tracking really well. How to fix your rebuttal? Because obviously I think most people do know how to generally give rebuttal. If you want to work on giving better rebuttal consistently, here are a couple things which you can do. The first is on matter generation. And I think matter generation is incredibly important in terms of rebuttal for two reasons. Firstly, for preemption. All this stuff I was talking about in prep, then you have to be able to think of what the other team are going to say, or what the most likely thing that they're going to say is. And so matter generation is really important for having good rebuttal. So ideally, you would know every single argument which the other team is going to run in the debate, and then you'd be able to respond to it way better, because you have 15 minutes, i.e. prep time, plus all the time that you're sitting in the debate to deal with their argument, rather than just when you're getting jumped by their argument, maybe halfway through prep. And so to be able to maximize both the strategy and the quality of your response, making sure to be spending as much time thinking about what the team are going to say and developing that skill of matter generation. The next thing which is really important is just to be faster when you do get jumped by that argument. Because also, if you think about it, making a piece of rebuttal is also generating some sort of argument or constructing some sort of matter for why the motion is not true on their side of the house. And so it's really important to be able to quickly come up and write those responses when you're in a debate, and then you can be better able to do all the other things which you have to do. And this is incredibly important to stress. You have 1,000,001 things to do when you're in that debate setting. So you will have to think, you have to track, you have to write POIs, you actually have to write out what you're going to say in your speech. And so thinking about responses should be the time which is minimized in your speech, so you have time to be able to do those other things. So, and basically I think probably the most important thing in a debate is to be thinking about the debate rather than writing or doing anything else. And so I think maximizing the amount of time that you're not thinking about why the other team is wrong is really important. So maybe filling in the gaps in your own case, for example. The aim, I think, and this is a rule which has been told to me by a couple really good debaters, is never write a response for a different argument when a team is constructing one argument. Because it means that you're unable to track that argument, or you're unable to compare whether that argument is important or not. So probably after they've said the headline of an argument, or they've said a couple mechanisms, you should be able to know your strategy or your team's strategy for beating that argument. And so do this, and then they're able to move on to their next argument, and you're able to take out the next argument. I think oftentimes the reason why my whips personally suffer is because I spend too much time getting caught up on an argument and writing a really good response for that argument. So it means I mistrack later parts of the debate, and I'm not focusing on them. So it's really important that you're able to quickly come up with a response, jot it down, and then move on, because I think that's really important. How can you get better at matter generation? This is kind of intuitive. Give lots of speeches. So the more motions you see, the more clashes you think about in a debate, then the more familiar you are with both how responsiveness works, but also how debates work. So give lots of PM speeches, for example. The next thing to do is case file more broadly. So this doesn't mean like write everything down in a document. It means think about debating on your day-to-day. So read news articles. So on Edinburgh, the Financial Times is free, and you can click the notification saying, I want you to notify me with my morning digest, and it'll tell you 5 things from across the world, which are all happening in like a lot of detail. And so you can literally log in with Edinburgh University. This is something which I highly recommend doing, and then you know stuff about the world, and then you can say more true things in debates. Watch good debates in your free time. I don't know, maybe if you're making dinner, you can do that. And chat to friends about debates. After you finish the debate, talk about what the potential extensions could be, etc. That will really help you to do matter generation in the future, and therefore think faster. We're going to be doing an exercise now. It's called Beat the Case. And this exercise basically is, I'm going to give you a 7-minute speech. And you're going to find out the motion basically a second before I give the speech. And you guys are going to beat the argument in that 7 minutes which I am giving the speech. I'm going to give 3 arguments in the speech. In this time, basically, after I finish speaking, you have to stop writing. You can still think about your prioritizing your responses, etc., because you can do that in a real debate. And I'm going to call on a random person to start giving their responses. I'm going to cut you off at any time, which means that it's incredibly important to prioritize the most important issue with my case, because I'm going to cut you off whenever. I'll let you finish your sentence, obviously. And so, yeah. So I guess get ready. If you want to opt out, then also just don't write, and I'll be able to see that you're not doing this. Okay. The motion is, this House would legalise psychedelics.
I was going to set this as a motion for
It was at comp recently.
What were you going to set this as a motion?
motion prep.
Oh, damn.
It's fine, I've got another one.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Our model is threefold. 1, we're going to sell these drugs in places like Boots. They'll have to ask the person at the counter and they're going to tell you how they work. Secondly, we're going to have governments either producing the chemicals or growing the mushrooms on farms, or they'll buy it from other governments. This means it's going to be regulated and well produced. 3, we're going to have regulation. For example, we'll happily create an LSD tax to reduce demand if we have to, and we'll ensure that it's of a certain quality where it won't blow your brains out, but it'll still be pretty nice to take. 3 arguments then. Firstly, this is good for medicinal drug users. Secondly, this is good for drug dealers. Thirdly, this is good for recreational drug users. Argument 1. The issue under the status quo is that companies or health services can't get to these drugs very easily. There's lots and lots of bureaucracy associated with accessing these drugs, if they're even allowed for medical purposes in your country. This is discouraged in research in favour of more convenient things, but it also means it's hard to prescribe to individuals who need it. This is because governments have been fighting a war on drugs inspired by the USA, propagating a narrative that they ruin lives. This is exacerbated by general social stigma associated with these drugs, but also it's ethically dubious to source these drugs illegally. I feel like it's obvious that it's hard for these places to get drugs under the status quo, but that logistically these organisations can't just hit up their local drug dealer, which means that when you're illegal, research and prescriptions on psychedelic drugs becomes incredibly hard. The potential benefits of these drugs are, it can be very good for people to work through trauma or PTSD. It can be very good for people with depression. It can be very good for people with OCD. I'm not sure on the biological mechanisms for these things, but basically these drugs make some people medically happier, and there are lots of studies coming out recently which have been saying this. Even if it's speculative, the benefit at the moment, it's hard to run clinical trials with these drugs, so potential life-saving medicine could be researched faster. But additionally, we would also find out long-term medical downsides of these drugs too, previously undiscovered, so that people can be properly informed about what they're putting in their body. And obviously we're going to be able to research this way more when the government is producing these drugs, because all you have to do is buy them from the local shop, so these clinical trials can just exist. Second argument, this is good for drug dealers. Currently, it's very dangerous to be a drug dealer. This is because as the chain of drug dealers goes up, the level of danger goes up. For a low level, you only have sold a couple of drugs, which means that you're not in demand that much from law enforcement. But as you go up the chain, then you're increasingly in demand. This means that people at the bottom of the chain are instrumentalized, so i.e. they're given immunity to rat on people at the top, etc. But it also means that there are high levels of suspicion as the chain goes up, because anyone below you wouldn't be too harmed by ratting you out, but to the authorities, because of stuff like immunity. This leads to immense amounts of danger and paranoia for drug dealers, which means that there's an incentive for violence. This is because somehow, as a drug dealer, you must create a rule of law for the lawless. Since you can't go to the police if people fuck you over, then you're going to have to create a really, really big threat. And if you have a really big threat, you have to show people that you don't make empty threats so they don't disobey you. This is exacerbated by the fact that there's a sunk cost associated with violence. Since I've already killed a person, what's that much worth with by killing another? This means that people have the capacity as well as the incentive for violence. This all means that there are lots of drug dealers at all levels who are subjected to immense amounts of suffering and violence on their day-to-day, since they can't get out of their shit situations. People know your address, people know your name and your family, and so these threats end up being very strong. Some drug dealers, we agree, will sell other stuff like cocaine, etc. But others who work on shroom farms or the LSD labs will no longer be subjected to these forms of violence. That's quite a lot of people who are stopping from suffering. But probably these people also have other skills to find other work. But also maybe even the government will buy their farms off them, and so they can make some amount of cash from this. Third argument is on recreational drug users. The issue with these people under the status quo is twofold. 1, the use of these drugs is incredibly widespread. Drug dealers are widely available, so if someone wants them, then there's no real barrier from accessing them. But they're also positively depicted in popular culture, such as with psychedelic art. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds is kind of a banger, and even if the depiction wasn't purely positive, it still piques interest. So for example, lots of people who smoke weed hear about the dangers of weed all the time, but still smoke weed. So this group of people particularly are still likely to engage in psychedelics, even if there's scaremongering, because their interest is likely to be piqued. The next reason is that these drugs are socially addictive. So if your friends are having a fun time doing them, then you're encouraged to join in. And the last is that they're psychologically addictive. LSD is created to give you euphoria, and so you want to feel that feeling again after you've used it. This means that the use of these drugs is quite widespread. The second issue under this status quo is these drugs can be very dangerous. There's a lack of information associated with these drugs. So organizations such as Healthline, Addicts Anonymous, and the NHS have institutional resistance against these drugs. They can't even slightly encourage them since they're illegal, so they just suggest the downsides of these drugs. This crowds out good information because there are no official sources telling you how to safely take these drugs, since that would be condoning people taking these drugs. They have to take every measure possible to stop you. Therefore, for information, you have to look at the back corners of Reddit. Anyone can be typing there, and there's no accountability if you get bad information. The reason that you might get bad information is twofold. Firstly, people might be misinformed about dosages, about what tabs of acid tend to contain in different countries, for example, and therefore they might accidentally misinform you. But secondly, people can be malicious. Everyone knows that all over the internet there are tons and tons of trolls who do very violent things all the time. It wouldn't be surprising if these people exist in these corners of Reddit. Although in the majority of cases people are fine, those who listen to bunk information are harmed drastically. They might be harmed by doing some dumb shit when they're high, leading to injury or societal repercussions if they say some dumb shit. They might be mentally scarred from a bad trip because they didn't take sufficient precautions. Or in the worst cases, people might overdose and go into perma-trip, which is possible. I've read about it. All of this can be very harmful, and we can prevent this on our side. Firstly, health websites now tell you how to safely take these drugs because it's legal, meaning that people are far more likely to get correct information. This importantly does not mean that people are not aware of the risks of the downsides. The NHS still tells people, like smokers, about the harms of smoking. But also, you must talk to the person who's going to give it to you, as in the model. So the person in the drug shop is going to tell you how to use it safely. Also, I feel like drugs tend to have the instructions on the packets, so maybe they can tell you how much you should take given your body weight. This means that people do this really harmful stuff less on our side of the house. The second issue is a lack of regulation. Drug dealers have an incentive to make them dangerous, given that they profit off of you continually showing up again and buying them. Drug dealers also have the capacity to make them addictive, given the average person can't test their tab of LSD, how much nicotine they can sprinkle on is probably fair game. But given they also make their drugs, they can make their drugs of poor quality, which can be dangerous as well. Just as baking soda in cocaine cuts costs. I'm sure for some psychedelics it can be cheaper to make a bunk version of it. I'm not an expert, but this also has potential to be incredibly dangerous. This can be really physically bad because addicts can't get help, for example, if you're addicted, because the use is stigmatized under the status quo. And there are no official channels to be able to, go to the hospital because you're worried about getting criminalized if you come out as, being harmed because you've taken some mushrooms. We fix this now when governments are regulating exactly at the inception point of these drugs how they're created, which means that people aren't facing these harms. Responses. Let's go, Cyrus.
The problem with the third and strongest argument of recreational users is a comparative one. If the issues are largely that these drugs are widespread and dangerous, we think that on our side we can access this widespread stuff far to a greater extent. As in, they're much more widespread if they're legalized, because there are obvious obstacles you talk about even in the second contention. As in, dealers want to be generally careful, and because individuals can actually have to find them in a legal market anyway. And instead they can just go to Boots, therefore they can more easily access the drugs. Therefore, there's an array of risks that we talk about, even if they're slightly less likely to happen, taking them at their best case, are less likely to accrue because we have a much wider volume of people taking more than drugs.
Stop. Adam.
The problem with people doing drugs unsafely isn't the lack of understanding about how to do it safely, but the lack of desire and willingness to do it safely. It's very likely that information exists, not only because there are forces like the NHS that don't want people to overdose, which you need very little information out there for people to be able to access it. Just one web page is enough saying obvious things, but also because within the community you know people who have overdosed or who have used unsafely, so you know how to do it safely. But the problem is people want more hits, they want a bigger high. You're not going to trust what the government is telling you because they're a complete spoilsport. Until recently it was illegal, they're going to tell you to be way safer than you have to be. They're the ones who are telling you to wear seatbelts all the time anyway. So of course you're not just going to do what the boring ass government tells you to, you're going to take bigger highs anyway, and that lack of desire to be safe still exists, even if the lack of understanding is resolved, because that was never the issue.
Stop. Zosha.
The third case is based on two big mischaracterizations. First of all, of how common drug use is in the status quo panel. We believe that right now, if you go up to most people on the street and ask if they have ever taken drugs, the answer will be no, because people are simply scared to do something that is illegal. They are scared that it is not as accessible to go find a dealer, and so we believe that the scale is actually much smaller. Secondly, the second mischaracterization is about the lack of information. There are campaigns being run, there are NA groups, etc. And so this is simply not comparative because those informational campaigns can exist on both sides of the house. However, the one thing that changes is the scale and the sheer number of people taking those drugs, because if it's more accessible, people are not scared to do it because they don't see it as something bad, that they can just go to a pharmacy and buy it. And so there's simply more people being exposed to the risk of drugs. And so we believe that taking the trade-off of having a few people doing it in a more dangerous manner on your side of the house, on our side of the house, is something that we are willing to accept simply because we are decreasing the total number of people taking those drugs and exposing themselves to the risks.
Nice. Let's go, Adam.
Okay, basically, the case says directly that there is not enough like research on this because like there are not studies done. This means that at the point when the government will actually start to send this will like send this and basically start reporting. The government won't actually have enough message. The like traders won't have enough message. At the same time, there will be actual demand to like sell this and to provide people some sort of like information about it. So you are likely to actually provide information that are incorrect and bad. And the worse is but that these informations are not from Reddit forum, but they are actually backed up by some like institution in which people more trust, and therefore people are even more likely to actually take these things based on like wrong information and, for example, overdose or just like take too much of it.
Nice. That was good. Nora?
Yeah, so the issue with your second contention is that it's unlikely that the drug dealers that you want to help are the same people who are going to deal drugs on our side of the house, right? They now have to compete with, as you said in your framing, places like Boots that are probably not going to be selling them for a ton of money. What they're likely to do is go to these other drugs that you talk about, cocaine, these other more dangerous drugs, and then what they're going to do is still be in this incredibly difficult, dangerous situation, or they're going to lose their jobs.
Yeah. Dom, were you preparing?
Yeah, sure.
Go for it.
I'll do more one. So I think the research conclusion is largely mixed on health benefits. There is a significantly increased risk of things like early onset schizophrenia. So that is something which you know will directly harm people, as opposed to be speculative health benefit. Then to deal with the idea that the reason why the medical health benefits haven't magically appeared yet is because of the cultural stigma, right? If it is true, it doesn't seem intuitive because the cultural reactions have already ended against drugs, and therefore the mechanism behind the stigma is kind of unpersuasive. Note again that the previous point would also contradict this position, because if this research is so promising, then why is it being allowed to happen if there is this intense cultural backlash?
Freya?
I was going to say like literally exactly that word.
Okay, that's fine. Leander?
So I think for me there's two real issues. One is kind of the characterization that I guess that there wouldn't be an illicit drug market even if like psychedelics were legalized, because I don't know, as far as I'm concerned, you do get the issue of scale. Like the second that you're getting psychedelics available at Boots, then there is a much wider scale of availability for those drugs, and so I just think there are like reasonable means by which people could exploit that system to access and then sell illicitly those same psychedelics. I don't think it mitigates the harm that exists from an illegal drug market.
Yeah, that's good. Tristan?
I was not taking notes.
Ryan?
You mechanize your own defeater twice if these drugs are particularly potent and desired in marginalized communities, one, and two, there's large systems of social conditioning through pop culture that emphasize taking these drugs as a positive experience. It's likely that in seeking profit, these drug centers will be set up in those marginalized communities, extracting wealth, and because of the pop culture depiction, it's likely that the warning from the guy behind the counter is likely to go unheeded. Yeah.
Wait, was this out recently?
It was like pro when I was at Cup.
Okay.
Or no, legal is what it was.
Well, that goes to show that you should be practicing your PMs, because then you know. I did get everyone, didn't I? Were you tracking? Oh, Iman, sorry. Go for it. You had that extra time.
Yeah, two important pieces of mitigation. Firstly, on the first case, on being able to cure people with certain diseases, it probably, even if medical systems in the status quo can't access psychedelics, they can access so many other kinds of medication, list them off. The second piece of mitigation is that the majority of people that are employed as drug dealers are employed in distribution and not in growing. And the structural reason for this is that one person can grow like 10,000 mushrooms, but one person can only deliver one tab to one person at a time. So the majority of people that are getting the whip in the status quo are in distribution, which doesn't change because they have to distribute other drugs. So that really smallens case 1 and 2, and then I would weigh whatever my LO has said.
Sick.
I think the biggest thing that we all missed is that you're selling, your problem is that people are buying cool drugs, and your plan is to undercut that by selling less cool, less strong, and more expensive drugs. Why are people just going to keep taking the illegal drugs?
Yeah, I think Leander said that.
Oh, sorry, I missed that. Sorry.
Yeah.
Tom, your camera's on.
Oh, sorry, I thought you weren't tracking. Go ahead.
I wasn't gonna go on everything was being said. Okay, sorry for some reasons. The only thought I have is that your case says that people can't get access to the medicinal psychedelics that might help them, but also that there is a lack of research about their long-term effects and whether or not they actually do help people who are sick. This is important because I think it's a very small number of people who, by not getting like medical LSD, go without any treatment at all. Like if you're so depressed that you're considering going on like illegal drugs that maybe your insurance can help you get, then you probably also have access to like therapy, right? Therefore, the people who get put on medicinal LSD are those whom nothing else helps, and so you're willing to trade off these possible unknown long-term side effects that we just haven't done the research about, because this is like the only protocol for you. What happens then when you legalize drugs that are dangerous? It's just that like it's more likely that sick people do take them and they don't take them via like medicinal channels, right? So not only does your case concede that we're not sure that it actually does help sick people, it also concedes that people believe that they do help, and so you end up like putting sick people basically at risk.
Yeah, that's good. So we can have a little chat. I don't know what this says. No, that's the next slide. We can have a little chat about that exercise. So I don't know if you guys were tracking each other, but after the exercise, especially the people who started first, did you think that your responses were the best ones to the case still?
I think there were other obvious things that got missed as well. Because I think the thing that Leander says that I repeat unwittingly is probably the most important response to both the second and the third case. It just completely undercuts them both to quite a significant extent.
Yeah.
But I think the best response to the first case also never came out, which is just that, like, the whole idea here is if you have these drugs being illegal, then culturally you want to do research into them medicinally. The vast majority of drugs used in medicine are also just illegal to sell on the street, right? Like any opiates, if you want to use morphine, codeine, whatever, fucking ketamine that you can give to people who have severe asthma attacks, any drug that you use to put people to sleep, all very well researched, all very significantly used. Obviously you can't buy them on the street. And so the connection there is just like really, really unclear. And I think the other responses are quite mitigatory, but I think that one just undercuts it completely.
Dom?
Yeah, I don't know if I overlooked this, but your second argument, which is bad. So I think no one wanted to like go for it.
Yeah.
Wasn't responded to at all, as far as I know.
Yeah, obviously it's got a very small delta.
It's like no one cares about dealers.
Yeah.
Like, you can claim that the people of lower down who are the most exploited have equal protections. So
yeah.
take out mafia bosses, blah blah blah.
I did find like my responses were being taken as the room went on. So I think people like in general prioritize like at least the correct material. Because when it got to me, I was like, I've got mitigation to certain premises, but probably in the speech I wouldn't say them.
Yeah, so this was going to be the next question. To the people who are last, what do you guys think the best responses were? Do you guys think that you gave the best responses? I guess Dom, who else went last? Ryan, Ayman, Esme.
What would I think the best response was?
Yeah.
I think the responses at the end were definitely worse.
Yeah.
I agree with that. My one was not good. I wouldn't say that if it hadn't already been said.
Yeah. Ryan.
Are there terms in VP? Do you guys use that word?
What is a turn?
It's when you take a premise and you derive from it a conclusion that supports your own.
Oh, a flip.
Your flip.
A flip. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, okay.
Turn and flip.
So I guess generally we were quite good at that exercise because we said the most important stuff first. This would also obviously depend on what your case was. This wasn't trying to talk about the strategy stuff I was talking about earlier, because obviously most of you guys would construct cases around those three arguments, which I think, you know, might be important within the debate. I think there's a couple more arguments that you could run. But yeah, that's also something which you can do yourself if you want to get better at rebuttal. I know it's something which some quite good WSDC teams do, is they just turn on a BP speech, they read the motion, and then they write out a rebuttal speech to it, and then try and piece together a structure and responses, etc. The second thing which I can fix is brew. I can definitely fix it. The third thing which I can fix is, what does this say? Tracking. Okay, this is
No, we talked about this.
This is why tracking is really important, because you know sometimes people say things messily, and so listening well is really important. That was the message from this slide. But tracking is really important, obviously, so you engage charitably. This is what I was talking about earlier, where basically, if you don't engage charitably, then judges just don't credit any of your rebuttal, even if some of it is true. So if it's clear that you haven't been tracking somebody else's case, then they don't try and insert for you, they're not trying to be generous or charitable to you. they think the worst of your own case. So make sure that you're tracking well, being ultra charitable, sort of interpreting their case as if it was constructed in a way that you think was better than it actually was. Because oftentimes, if you're sitting in a debate and you're listening to someone else's speech, if you're thinking about all the responses you give to that speech, sort of intuitively or subconsciously, you're thinking about their case worse than it is. Because you sort of have to train yourself into thinking that everyone else is really bad so that you can rebut it. But you have to undo that sort of psychological decision which you have made and sort of fill in some gaps, because probably that's how the case is appearing to a judge which is listening to it. That's at least how I find. I sometimes think, this case is absolutely stupid, but actually a judge is crediting it because I'm just in that debate headspace where I'm thinking, this argument's really bad because I want to be able to beat it. The next thing is, so don't strawman. You can strawman Rodan really well. Judges credit it because he speaks too fast. The next thing is understand. That's the only time you can strawman. The second thing is understanding gaps in analysis. Obviously, you want to be able to track really precisely and really accurately so you can find the gap. This is especially important against really, really good teams, sort of contrarily, because sometimes if you're debating a team in a top room, you think this team is unbeatable, but actually the teams are beatable and you are able to beat all those really good teams. And so not missing gaps in analysis, which all those teams are going to have, is really important. And even if you think they have a really good vibes case and really seemingly well constructed, if you think, hold on, there's a little bit of a gap here, if you point that out to the judges, even if the judges have filled it in a little bit in their own head, if they can't see it in their notes, then that's something which you can exploit. So always make sure that you're finding gaps even in really good teams. The last thing is not missing whole arguments. Sometimes there's an argument which is run at the last minute, which is winning a debate. Make sure you're catching those arguments as well, because tracking that is really important. How to do this? This is kind of similar, just debate a lot. A piece of advice which I've been taking on recently, which is really important, is actually not writing all the time during a debate. Because oftentimes I find myself writing and I'm sort of zoning out because I just assume that that writing is helping me to internalize those messages. So actually listening and critically sort of putting the speech into your own terms and then putting that on the paper is the real way that you should be tracking, because then you're actually thinking about what they're saying and the implications of their argument rather than just writing down what they're saying word for word. This is also important because people speak really imprecisely and speak with way too many words, and so you can afford to write less if you interpret what they say and write it down in 3 words instead of the 10 words which they were saying. The last thing on tracking is being efficient in your notes as well. So shortening words from climate change to CC. This might be something which you're doing, but if you're not, it might change your life. And the last thing is don't track one thing when the speaker's on to the next. This is the same with rebutting, so make sure that you're not writing down one thing that a speaker has said before when they're saying something new, because then you missed the new thing. The last thing is work on prep time with your partner. I don't really know what to say to you about this. It's just what your vibes are with your partner, but make sure that you always have time to be thinking about what your responses are in both positions. Always be thinking about what the other team are going to say. Make sure that that's something which you're doing. I think that's everything I have for today. Starting 5 minutes early. Questions?